Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing an interview with Rabbi Joshua Berman. We're going to be discussing several issues in terms of a book that he wrote called Ani Maamin, which I'll show now. Okay, on the left side is the English version of the book, and the right side is the Hebrew version of the book. This is actually the Hebrew version, is the one I have, and the one I've been reading from. Um, the reason why I invited Rabbi Berman to talk with me is because, as anyone's ever seen my channel, I try to discuss a lot about the text of the Torah, the text of the Tanakh. Its linguistic aspects to it, the cultural and historical aspects to it. And I kind of address this from, not really pulling any punches, just kind of showing the text, discussing different ideas that existed about it, and then going through kind of elements of history as well as, like I said before, the linguistics. So I've invited him to come on and talk about his book, Ani Maamin, and just some ideas about his book. So Rabbi Berman, I appreciate you coming on to my channel, and I appreciate you agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you for having me, Ehav, and I'm looking forward to our talk.
Okay. So I sent you a group of questions, about four questions that I think can be like a springboard for the discussion we have. And, I'd really just like to hear your input on them. I'm going to every once in a while just kind of maybe ask questions or mention little things. But specifically, I just wanted to hear your kind of comments on them. So the first question I had was concerning your book, Ani Maamin, what goal did you have in writing the book?
Yeah, so I don't know if people can see on the screen as clearly as I can see. The subtitle kind of says it all: Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. Um, Growing up, I remember when I was in yeshiva in the mid 80s, and I remember hearing that there were boys in yeshiva that were delving into biblical criticism, and I thought to myself, wow. Like that's really commitment because this yeshiva that I was in, which was in Israel, had no books on this topic because that topic is taboo.
Hmm.
Biblical criticism is, like this and this and this. And, here we heard these rumors about guys doing that, which meant that they had to get on a bus, travel an hour to Jerusalem,
Hmm.
and then another bus to get to the National Library, and then somehow navigate the bowels of the National Library to go find books about biblical criticism
Hmm.
because there was no internet and there was no way to know anything about it unless you did that. But fast forward now, some 30 or 40 years, and now biblical criticism is everywhere. Even if you don't go after it, it goes after you. If you want to know something about, you just type in the Exodus and Google that, well, you'll get some stuff that's traditional and you'll get stuff that's not traditional. So that all the issues raised classically by biblical criticism, when was the Torah written? Who wrote it? How many documents? Are there other documents? All these things suddenly became communal issues on a much wider scale than they had been. And kind of perched between the world of tradition, where I come from. I studied I have a day school background, and I learned in a Hesder yeshiva, maybe some have heard of it, Gush, in Alon Shvut in Israel for 8 years. So I have that background, and I also, I have a PhD in Bible, and I teach academic Bible and write academic articles and books. It seemed like this was a goal worthy of tackling or of trying to build a bridge that would allow people spiritual and intellectual integrity.
Okay. So would you say that in that vein, that there was kind of like an opening that you saw, and a kind of a lacking area, that on some level you felt that needed to kind of be bridged for really people to be able to enter into. And the reason why I ask it kind of in that way, I've had this idea that's kind of been going through my head based upon some of the conversations I've had with people, and also some of the challenges I've had with people who I guess would almost say that there was no such thing, or historically has never been such a thing as, Tanakh criticism or biblical criticism within the rabbinical slash Jewish community. And one of the arguments I've always made is, okay, well, I consider the Talmud to be, on some level, a written text that is a type of criticism, depending on you look at it. So would you say that your book is, almost to fill kind of a modern void that some people have, within the learning system that does exist?
Well, yeah, because the types of questions that are asked in the academy were never asked in the Talmud, and the assumptions behind the question are radically different too.
Okay. Right. And I think you like you mentioned before. I know, for example, with the internet being what it is. I mean, at one point, for example, a person could say, "Well, the books were my internet. Whatever books I could have available, that was pretty much my ability to search information." Where now you could have someone who could learn, for example, I know with myself, I give you, just a quick example personally. I started trying to like learn Hebrew when I was in my early 20s because I was in university, and then I had a conversation with my grandmother, and I'd made a decision. Okay, I need to start learning, Hebrew as much as possible. At the time where I was in Texas, there wasn't really a lot of places I could go to try to learn Hebrew. So I just picked up whatever book I could and tried to learn it. And then when I moved to New York, that's when I was actually able to sit down and like really learn specifically. But I know one of the things that really gave me I guess a really big push in the direction I really wanted to go in was I found a lexicon that actually did a really good job of breaking down the Shorter system. And that really helped me kind of understand not just that I'm learning words here, but I'm actually learning etymology at the same time. What would you say to, that kind of take up on learning, especially within Hebrew itself, where the etymology plays a big role?
All Hebrew words ultimately derive from roots. All Hebrew names derive from roots. So roots are really, really key to understanding not only the language, but I would say even the thought system as
Hmm.
well.
And what about the thought system would you say is like found in that system, for example?
Just that's really too big for me to answer. Like, just we'd have to look at something specific and then see, the nuances of words and how the verb plays out in different ways in different places. But
Hmm.
you know, I don't think that you can really understand biblical thought fully without command of the language.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, and that's something that I've also found that sometimes I've come across people who, when I've been on like a couple of forums, for example, and I kind of just had a practice where I would join a forum and just say, okay, let me see what people are talking about. And there are times where people will present something as if they fully know the language without understanding the context that it's like played in, linguistically as well as historically. And I found that to be like kind of something that people really have to have an interest in and also have to like delve into to really understand what the Tanakh is talking about.
Right. Right.
So the next question I had was, what has been the response from scholars and laymen alike towards your book?
Oh wow, not what I expected. I figured when this book came out, seeing that it tries to bridge tradition and critical thought, which are normally conceived of as oil and vinegar,
Hmm.
I thought that I would get two responses. I would have half the world would say Berman, that heretic, from the traditional side, and from the academic side, they would say Berman, that fundamentalist.
Hmm.
But for better or for worse, that hasn't been the case. From the traditional side, what I've seen, look, I think that there are probably a lot of traditional Jews who have no interest in this topic, and that's fine,
Hmm.
and who would never pick it up, and that's fine too.
Hmm.
But the ones that have picked it up, the responses have been overwhelmingly positive. I would say that, I mean, I get emails and Facebook messages about the stuff in the book all the time. It's now been 5 years since it came out. And I would say actually that I have received more correspondences about the book from Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jews than I have from all
Hmm.
other types of Jews combined.
Okay.
Whereas we would normally think, oh, the ultra-Orthodox, they're just into the traditional way of doing things
Hmm.
and, would obviously have no interest in this. But this just goes to show that the walls have come down.
Hmm.
And that, once you have a smartphone in your hand, you're exposed to everything that's out there. And
Right.
so regardless of what your background or what your hat looks like,
Hmm.
your brain is seeing all this stuff.
Right.
So from certainly from the traditional side, very, very positive because I think people have been looking for they don't want to live in a world where they have to do this, and this all the time.
Hmm.
It's spiritually corrosive when you live that way.
Right.
And everything that I do, I try to bring traditional sources to show where I'm coming from and what their implications are. So that's from the traditional side. From the academic side, so I would say this. I'll give you the good news and the bad news. Okay. The
Hmm.
good news is that there have been about, I don't know, a dozen or 14 book reviews of
Hmm.
not of this. This is a popularized version of an
Hmm.
academic version of this
Okay.
called here, I'll bring you a copy you can show everybody. One second. I have it right here. Um, it's called Inconsistency in the Torah,
Hmm.
Ancient Literary Criticism, and Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Source Criticism. The idea being basically that biblical criticism starts when scholars note things that look to be inconsistent in the Torah,
Hmm.
either outright discrepancies or seemingly needless repetitions. And so this academic version came out from Oxford University Press in 2017.
Hmm.
Ani Maamin is a kind of a popularized version, also with some more theology in it and rabbinic sources, came out in 2020. So going back to the good news and the bad news. So there have been about a dozen or so reviews of inconsistency in the Torah, and they've all been positive. So
Hmm.
that's certainly good news,
Yeah.
by academics in academic forums. Now, here's the bad news. There's been a dozen reviews of inconsistency in the Torah in academic venues, and they're all positive.
Okay.
That's the bad news. What do I mean that every author? Why would that be bad news?
Hmm.
If all the reviews are good, why is that bad news?
Hmm.
Because what that means is that the people that I am taking to task about their methodology are simply not reading the book,
Oh, okay.
and therefore not writing about it.
Right.
And this, I think that people have a view of the academic world which is a little more pristine than what it really is.
Hmm.
People think sometimes that in academic discourse, well, academics just look at the facts and deal with things dispassionately and objectively. And
Hmm.
of course, that if they are, worthy of their lofty titles, then they must obviously read everything that's relevant in their particular field of research. And all those things turn out to be not always true.
Hmm.
That is, that people have agendas. People sometimes their agenda is what does my CV include, and therefore I have to guard it, preciously.
Hmm.
And sometimes people are kind of locked into a certain methodology or an approach, and they will read everything that's within there. But if you're not within those goalposts, then you are out of bounds,
Hmm.
and therefore not worth reading. So, yeah, there's been a lot of people in the academy who have said nice things about it, and a lot of people haven't read it,
Hmm.
so and wouldn't want
Interesting.
to read it. That's the best that I can say.
Can you give some examples of things that people have found either inspiring or has really moved them in terms of reading the book? And I asked that within a certain vein that, as an example, a few years ago, there was a physicist that I once read where he was saying that, people think that scientists are always like, they'll come in the news and say, well, they have to go back to the drawing board. And he said that, look, if you're a scientist doing real research, you're always at the drawing board. There's no such thing as that we've got it all figured out. We can just put our hands behind our heads and just say, we've figured it all out, we're done. What things can you say that your book has brought out within people that has kind of put them back to the drawing board?
Wait, you asked originally what inspired them. That's one question, and now you're
Correct.
asking me what have sent people back to the drawing board.
Yeah, I think that I look at it, for example, when I get inspired, it's usually based on things that I can't say I've heard that before. For example, in your book, I noticed some of the things about the numbers that are mentioned in the Torah.
Well, lots of
Um,
things, yeah.
yeah, there was areas where I had heard that before, but I'd never really seen it kind of written out in a way to where I could say, okay, I've got to think about that. Because that opens up how I think about what numbers are actually there and why they're there.
Yeah, so that's part of a larger question. I'll just take this. There are many, many points that I could point to. I think that one of the things that people have really found eye-opening is what we expect history writing to look like and what we expect it to be doing. And the question, as I say here in the subtitle, that the book is partly about historical truth, meaning should we assume that the Tanakh, the Bible, reports to us in its stories facts and only facts, 100% facts? I'm not saying that's an important religious question. It's also an important academic question, and it doesn't merely come down to the question of, well, what does archaeology tell us, and what do epigraphic sources from other cultures tell us? There's a fundamental assumption here about what we're looking for and why we're looking for that requires itself examination. By that I mean that it turns out that the notion that responsible writing about the past must be fully factual 100% of the time is a very modern notion.
Mm.
And that pre-modern writers, even pre-modern what we call historians, such as Herodotus or Thucydides or Josephus, who we call historians, and they write about the past, and we look at that and we say, gosh, it certainly sounds like they're writing history. They were not actually doing what we call history.
Hmm.
That what they were doing was taking it was a form of sermonizing, of education, of inspiring people, in which they took accounts of the past, but they gave themselves a lot of leeway to embellish things, never quoting sources, and so it's a different genre of writing. It's 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 writing about the past in a way that I would say is the difference between a photograph and a painting.
Hmm.
Okay. In other words, when you make a painting of something, yeah, you can still see, there's trees, or it's Ahav in that picture that I painted. But if I do a painting of you, Ahav, I probably won't make it as, perfect pixel, high res, sharp
Hmm.
as the image that's in front of us right now. I would do something a little stylized. I would want to bring out the spirit of Ahav.
Hmm.
And if I were to do that as a painter, and people, your audience were to look at that, nobody would say that doesn't look exactly like Ahav.
Hmm.
No, they would say, wow, that painter really got the spirit of what Ahav is about,
Hmm.
because we don't expect a painting to be a photograph,
Hmm.
and we shouldn't expect scripture to be a photograph either. It's a painting of the past. And so there's going to be a little bit of embellishment and a little bit of crafting and a little bit of writing for the sake of inspiration. This is the way all ancient history writing was done.
Hmm.
I think that's a new idea to people, and I think that is enormously liberating for people, because when they hear, "Oh no, it says in Nehemiah that the wall of Jerusalem went this way, but now archaeology tells us that no, it was actually 200 meters to the east of that, and therefore, you see, Scripture is not telling the truth." And if it's not telling the truth about where the wall was in the time of Nehemiah, well, boom, the
Hmm.
balloon just bursts, doesn't it? And the answer is no, it doesn't burst at all. The
Hmm.
purpose of Nehemiah in talking about the wall, he was the ideas of whatever chapter that was. There's several chapters about the wall in the book of Nehemiah, but we weren't expecting Nehemiah to give us a photograph. He's giving us a painting. All of Scripture is like that, and there are rabbinic sources for this too. Rabbi Cook says this almost explicitly.
Hmm.
Okay? Yeah,
That's interesting. I
yeah.
think one way also to kind of express what you're saying from as one of the things I studied a number of years ago in the Yemenite community was the use of song as a way of like telling history, for example.
There you
And
go.
there's a book called the Diwan. If any people are watching this, the Diwan is a group of songs. Some of them originate from Yemen, some of them originate from Spain. And there are a number of the songs that are actually talking about events that took place, for example, when the Jews of Sana'a, the capital city of Yemen, were kicked out by the Sultan to die in the desert. And for example, one of the songs describes having to like remove one's atorot. Um, and the way it's describing it is basically saying that this person's asking me to remove my religion. But it's the way the song is written, someone who hears it and it's translated for them would just think, okay, they're just singing about dancing. I don't, just some, whatever. But someone who knows the wording and the way that the culture is used, it's like, okay, he's actually talking about this event in history, but he can't say it publicly because of the environment he's in at the
Okay.
time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a different way of telling history on some level. And in some level in modern, even Western society, there are other people who do something similar, but not everyone thinks of it as like history per se, or
Mhm.
the way that they perceive history. So that's a really interesting point that you made there.
You couldn't study history, Ahav, until 1810.
Mm.
What do I mean by that? You could talk about the past, but as a discipline, the
Hmm.
first department of history is in Berlin in 1810.
Hmm. Interesting.
It's a modern way of thinking about the past. This idea that, wow, there might really be authentic, original sources that if we just dig deep enough in the ground, we'll pull them out. Or if we find old archives and go through all the shelves and pull things out, we'll actually be able to discover things about the past that are maybe a little different than the oral traditions that we have received. That's
Right.
a dawning consciousness that really only begins around the beginning of the 19th century.
Right. Yeah, I think another idea that I noticed in your book, and again, I have to kind of preface this with the fact that I was reading the Hebrew version of it, was a section that talks about the difference between how, I guess, like Hok is looked at in the past versus the present law, for example,
Yeah.
or the concept of law. And that was something that I was really thinking about because, the idea that someone says, okay, well, the law is this because it's written in subsection D, C, whatever it is, versus like, let's say someone looking at Hammurabi's code. And how would someone of the ancient world have looked at that, where they may not have ever even seen it in writing or even understood the writing aspect of it, but simply have lived out the legalities of their time in a way that like is different than the way we do in the modern era.
Hmm.
So that's something that I kind of took heart to when I was reading earlier today when I was just prepared for this discussion. That difference of thinking, okay, well, that is interesting. When I think about how, let's say, my grandmother, my great grandfather, would have looked at his understanding of a concept versus the way I look at it now. It's
Oh,
just.
yeah. I mean, it's just shocking. I'm going to give you a list of words
Mhm.
that have no parallel in either biblical Hebrew or rabbinic Hebrew, which means the concepts themselves didn't exist. Okay, here
Mhm.
we go. Fact versus fiction. There's no way to say those words in
Right.
biblical or rabbinic Hebrew.
Hmm.
In the Bible, there's no word for author. There's
Hmm.
no word for history,
Hmm.
either in biblical or rabbinic Hebrew. Even this is shocking. The word belief,
Right.
to believe as a verb or
Hmm.
even as a noun, belief number one, belief number two. Okay,
Hmm.
there's no word for belief as a noun.
Hmm.
Okay, as you know, as in a code or a catechism of what are our beliefs. It's
Right.
remarkable. The Torah it doesn't list beliefs. The
Hmm.
rabbis didn't list beliefs. What's going on? Isn't that so important? Why is Maimonides the first one to do that? Um, um, the word law.
Hmm.
The word law doesn't really, yes, some people might say, what are you talking about? There's mishpat, there's chok. There are very major differences between our notion of law and what they were thinking about when they used those terms. That
Right.
is to say, the notion that we all have as moderns, whether we're talking about civic law,
Hmm.
can I build an extension to my house? Is that allowed by the bylaws of my city? Or whether we're talking about halacha, um, in both those instances, when we say the word law, we're referring to codified law. There's a law book, whether
Hmm.
there's a law book about how far away from the curb buildings must be, or whether there's a codified book about whether this action is permitted to us on Shabbat.
Hmm.
We are accustomed to thinking of the word law, whether civil law or our religious law, as being codified and it's written down, and there you just see what it says and you'll know what to do. That notion didn't exist. It's not just that people were illiterate or it wasn't written. No one would have thought that in order to learn what to do, you go look it up. That just
Hmm.
didn't exist.
Right. Yeah, and I think also you can even look in modern Hebrew, the differences between modern Hebrew and certain words versus like ancient Hebrew. One example I gave to someone is the idea of being like of dat, or being dati,
Sure.
being religious in the modern context. Anciently, the word doesn't really mean religion, or anything like that. It's usually like a statute or a law, and even then, you get into ideas. Okay, well, what does that even mean?
Right, there's another one. There's no ancient word in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew or in rabbinic Hebrew that's parallel to our word religious.
Right.
And there's no word in biblical Hebrew or rabbinic Hebrew analogous to our word political or politics.
Right.
Even though we think, well, that's so obvious that you must have politics and religion. No, but you see, once upon a time, you see that's another modern thing that religion and politics, which you think, oh, religion and politics, separate them, right?
Yeah.
That's only since like the 17th century, when I think in England or something, they saw that religion was causing endless wars, and they were like, okay, the way we get past all these wars is to make religion, we're going to defang religion. We're
Hmm.
going to make religion exclusively about the individual's own personal sphere,
Hmm.
but not something that the state engages in at all. But
Right.
in ancient times, all thought systems, they were all very religious, Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Tanakh, all
Hmm.
very religious and all very political, lots of
Hmm.
kings in all these places. And the religion and the politics are all mixed together because in those thought systems of the ancient world, Torah or not Torah. All of existence was in one unified view of things. There was
Hmm.
no separating out, oh, well, this is religious. Oh, that's political. No, there's God's order, or there's Mat in Egyptian,
Hmm.
order, or the right way or something in Mesopotamian thought, and it's all encompassing. So this is a modern notion that we have that religion, that's what you do in your home or in your
Hmm.
synagogue or in your school. It's not what happens in the public. It's not what
Hmm.
happens in the state. That's
Hmm.
that's that's newfangled, folks. Sorry, it's not how the Tanakh thinks about things.
Right. And I think one of the things I try to explain to someone, just to kind of understand that point that you're mentioning, is I said, okay, well, think of it this way. Let's go back several thousand years ago in this region. We only get rain in the wintertime for the most part. So if we're in a situation where there is no rain, a person may say, okay, look, I don't normally go do anything, but at the moment we're missing rain, so I may need to like kind of up my game a little bit and do something so we can get some rain around here. And what that means modernly would be different than someone saying it, 1,000 years ago in terms of what they, if we want to use the word believe, for example, and what they do with that understanding of how the world and the universe works. Um, and I think that that's one of the things that when I try to like, especially after starting reading your book, and also I was kind of at the same time I started reading just the commentary of Ibn Ezra, for example, just to kind of look at like the way that he deals with things in terms of understanding the text as well. I kind of said to myself, okay, well, let's, I try to explain to the people I do videos for sometimes to say, every time that we pick up the Torah, because of the fact that even as Jews and having this Masorah, this tradition that's been passed down, we sometimes have to enter into the world as it was thousands of years ago and try to understand it from the perspective
It's the
of
only
our
way.
ancestors from thousands of years ago, knowing that even though I descend from them, I'm not in the same mindset. I mean, I don't. I have to look at a phone and think about what's happening to the phone. Someone 1,000 years ago said that's not my problem. My problem is I need rain. And I don't have the ability to grow crops with rain. Having family members who grew up on a farm, I once went to stay on their farm and was like, okay, this is different than what I'm used to. And that's one of the things that I have tried to explain to people that it's just in some cases just a different mindset. And you have to sometimes say, okay, well, I can make my conclusions on the Torah with the modern mindset that I have, based upon the foundations that we know are there. But sometimes I still have to go backwards and say, let me try to enter into that mindset based upon what we've been told from all the different sources, whether it be Rashi from the perspective he has, sometimes coming from Midrashim, whether it be the Rambam from the perspective he has, the Ramban, and that's why I try to collect as many as possible to kind of say, okay, now that I've read through all of this, what conclusions can I make based upon the variety of understandings that exist? And what way can I try to put myself in that ancient mindset and then take that back into the modern era and say, okay, this is the way I go forward with all of the tools that I've got there.
Hmm.
So I think the third question I had was, okay, what advantages, and I think we've already discussed this just a little bit in some way, are there in studying the local ancient languages and cultures regarding understanding the Torah? Just to kind of explain that a little bit more, what I mean is, I found myself at one point starting to look into Akkadian, just to kind of understand how the language works. And one of the reasons it started for me personally was I was trying to explain to someone who is, I guess, mainly just an English speaker, the difference between the concept of the word Elohim in Hebrew versus the word God in English. That it's not always translatable, um, especially when you deal with the concept of the shortish of the words that are used to describe, Hashem, for example, like Elohim, El, Eloah, coming from, a background of Aleph, Vav, Lamed, or Aleph, Yud, Lamed, meaning like strength, power, and things like that, versus the word God in English, usually meaning specifically deity, everything around that. So, what advantages can you think of, or what, in the idea of studying local languages too, that are kind of surrounding Hebrew throughout its history, that may have had influences in the language and how it was perceived during ancient times? What advantages could someone learn from that?
Well, the advantage is that you get to accuracy and you get to understanding. It's that simple. Let me give an example. In the Bible, we have a book called the Book of Judges.
Hmm.
Book of Judges, right after the conquest and the time of Joshua, there's a kind of a turbulent period before kingship called the period of the Judges. And you look at that book, you read that book, and it's about a series of snapshots of leadership in different times, by people who nominally are called the judges, but you kind of scratch your head because they don't look like they're judging.
Right.
You don't see courts, they
Hmm.
don't give rulings, they don't talk about legal ideas.
Hmm.
Most of those judges are just soldiers
Hmm.
or military leaders. So why is this called judges? Why are we calling them judges? Well, so in Hebrew, the book of Judges is Sefer Shoftim, the book of Shoftim, and Shofet, it's certainly in modern Hebrew, means a judge.
Hmm.
And it also means in many places in the Bible, it means judge also. But the root of the word shofet, its origin etymologically, is in Akkadian, which you mentioned before, And that word shapatu in Akkadian is a generic word for leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders. So a judge is a form of leader, but really the book of Shoftim, what we nominally call the book of Judges, is the book of leaders, and that's much more accurate. Yes, they're not kings,
Mm-hmm.
they're not always generals. Sometimes they're just ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
One case does seem maybe to be, I don't know, Deborah. She's not a general, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So there, and Samson, he's not a general either. He's just, kind of a Rambo type of guy on his own.
Mm-hmm.
They're all different forms of leaders. So, once you see that, you go, oh, now it makes sense.
Right. And I think also one of the things that I've liked a few years ago, I started this process where I started going through starting at Sefer Yehoshua all the way like to wherever I could get and just kind of just reading each area on every Shabbat and just kind of going through and trying to see what ideas I can come from it. One of the things I noticed not too long ago that I'd read about in the past, but I never really paid too much attention to it, was one of the stories with King Achav, sorry, and his meeting with Yehoshaphat. And the idea that Yehoshaphats like, okay, we're going to go to this war, but let's bring out some Nevi'im. Let's get some Nevi'im in here to kind of tell us what's going on, to kind of give us an idea of what we need to do. And all of them that are brought in are like all these guys saying, hey, you guys are going to win. It's going to be perfect. Everything's great. And then Yehoshaphats like, well, wait a minute, is there anybody else maybe? And Achav is like, yeah, there's one guy, but he never says good things. He always says bad things, about about me. And I've just found that to be really comedic, to some level that that got included into a text that has so many serious overtones to it, potentially from our modern perspective. But to have something like that in there that seems almost comedy, especially
Well,
when the
yeah,
Navi
it's like,
shows up.
it's like who do you invite to your press conference? No, don't invite him. He's not going to write good things about me. Only
Right.
only bring in the people who agree with my political position.
Right. And I love the part where he says, look, I told you he would say bad things.
Yeah, right. It is
I
kind of a
told you.
parody. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so that's where are there any other examples like that, for example, of things that we can look at and say, that must be comedy in the regions around
Wow. Uh-huh.
um, because that's sometimes the thing that's hard to determine whether or not, you're reading something that's just serious or you're reading something that, the cultures were, especially given like there not being a tradition passed on throughout the generations of how to understand what they're writing, we could easily be reading something and it could be a comedy for all we know, on
Right.
some level.
Right. Right. I mean, I think, when you read in the book of Esther, and Haman in chapter 6,
Hmm.
Haman he comes before the king, and the king says, well, what should I do for someone I really like?
Right.
I really want to give him a lot of honor and regard.
Hmm.
And Haman says, oh, well, that obviously must be me.
Right.
So he gives a whole long laundry list of things that the king should give this person who he really regards highly. And then, sure enough, it turns out that it's none other than Haman's nemesis,
Hmm.
Mordecai. And then
Hmm.
Mordecai gets all of it. And then Haman has to parade around Shushan,
Hmm.
pulling the horse that Mordecai is on. I mean,
Right.
that's, there's something a little bit of a parody or comedy there, I think, to some degree.
Right. Right. And I could even say, like, going back to Kim Achav, one of the things again, just when I started, like, when I moved to Israel and started kind of really like reading things only in Hebrew, because that's one of the commitments I made before I made Aliyah, where I said, okay, I'm going to buy every book I can in Hebrew. I mean, I'm going to just, really read everything in Hebrew as much as possible because I'm going and I want to get as fluent as possible. But I really read through the book of Kings at one point and I started saying, okay, wait a minute, Achav's wife, Izevil, is that really her name? Or did someone just kind of
Hmm.
say, "Oh, okay, here comes Ezevel, And that's
Hmm.
where, it's kind of like, okay, you go back to the idea we were talking about earlier about entering into the mindset of
Right.
someone several thousand years ago. What would they have thought when they heard that name, Ezevel? You know?
Well, I don't know if Zevel must mean garbage.
Hmm.
It might mean, but I mean, probably its origin is like Zvul.
Right,
Zvul is like, I don't know, an offering or something, or a feast or something like that.
right,
It's interesting that the same root that means feast can be what happens after the feast, which is the garbage. I don't know.
right,
That's interesting. Yeah.
right. So then the fourth question I had was what importance would you place on analyzing the Torah with the mindset of the time frame it dates from? And we've talked about this quite a bit, but I would just kind of like to hear you go freestyle on, what your thoughts are about that, of the mindset of the time frame that it
Yeah, the
dates from.
reason it's so important is I think that so often the things that don't make sense to us about the Torah and about the Tanakh take on a new light when we understand ancient Near Eastern context.
Mhm.
Um, that's in one line.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I think, like I said before, one of the things that kind of drove me to do this interview also was, like I told you before, that I sometimes take part in what I would say is a forum that deals sometimes with what I would call religious issues. And one of the things that came up was someone was challenging me about the idea of the Torah being written in the time frame that we claim that it's written in, based upon the tradition that we have. And one of the things I was saying was, well, there's a lot of Near Eastern texts that talk really similar to the way the Torah is,
Yeah.
but I find that if you don't really engage in the text themselves, and not just simply from the standpoint of someone wrote an article about it, I'll just take that and say that that's what is true, and which it could be. But I find a lot of my ideas are challenged when I say, okay, look, I don't fully understand Akkadian or this Sumerian text, but I'm going to try to learn it and try to read it as much as I can to gain whatever I can from it to try to enter in that mindset rather than letting someone's translation be the mindset that I get from it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's one of the things that's kind of driven me in certain areas where I'll say, okay, I'm trying to learn this aspect in Torah. Here's a connecting culture that I'm trying to understand. Let me like maybe take their text, take a script where I can learn the script as much as possible. And for this moment, try to enter into their mindset by learning their language as much as possible and then going from there. And it's really changed the way I look at the Torah.
Yeah, or you can try to find scholarship that does that. There are people who spend their whole days doing this sort of thing.
Right,
That's also I find that very helpful.
right. So that's the questions I had, and that's the time frame I had. And I really appreciate you doing this interview
Okay.
with me. I've really enjoyed it, and it's really expanded the way I think about things. And again, I want to kind of put your book out there again so people can see it. The English version's on the left side, Ani Maamin, and then those who want to read it in Hebrew, the Hebrew's on the right side. So, if I can just ask one question about it, oh, did the idea of the cover, did that come from you, or did it come from the publisher itself?
Oh wow. I mean I didn't do the actual design, but the concept was mine and the photograph was mine. I mean I didn't take the photograph, but
Right.
finding the image. I wanted something that conveyed the idea that this book was going to be about the ancient world and
Hmm.
seeing the Torah in the ancient world. And I thought that uh the image of slaves, bound, which you can
Hmm.
see very clearly, even these aren't Israelite slaves, okay? But I think that a Jew looking at a book on this topic and seeing this image, it conjures
Right.
immediately that there's Exodus, and there's a lot of discussion in my book about the Exodus and proofs for the Exodus, etc.
Right.
So that's why I chose this image.
And I'll definitely say it
I'll
definitely is
just, I'll
the.
just let me just say one thing, Ahav. At the
Mhm.
time, I didn't realize this, but if you look above the third figure, right? There's three slaves on the cover, right? If
Right
you
on the
look
right
along
side.
the third one, the rightmost one, above him,
Hmm.
those hieroglyphs there say the name of the Egyptian god Amun.
Hmm.
Amun.
Okay.
So someone who knows Egyptian said to me, "Oh, did you put Amun at the top of your book called Ani Maamin
Uh,
deliberately?" So, I mean, I hadn't, but there you
mhm.
go.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah,
Who
I'll
knows?
definitely say that when I think I first heard of your book from when you were on Judaism Demystified, and I saw the cover of the book, and it did catch my eye, and I was like, okay, this is
Well,
interesting.
that's 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 what
I have to
that's what we
look into
hope to
this.
do in a cover. Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
I was so glad when I live in Jerusalem, so I was so glad that one of the local bookstores had the Hebrew version. I was like, okay, I have to have that one.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So once again, Rabbi Berman, I appreciate you doing this interview with me.
Okay, Hav, thank you
You take
very
care.
much, and blessings to the audience.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay.